When you think about startups, you think of Silicon Valley. But right now, in Africa, there's a new king in the jungle that is giving Silicon Valley a run for its money. And this is the Silicon Savannah. And this is situated right here in Kenya, in Nairobi. And it's sort of like the startup capital of Africa. And recently, right from the lion's mouth, there have been conversations about the demands that a lot of African startups are expected to fulfill. And one of them is needing to have a white founder. And a lot of conversations have been focusing on how unfair this is, about how this is a new age of colonization, because why would they need white people to be the face of African startups? And in this episode today, I want us to think about the subject not from an emotional point of view, but from a business point of view. We need to ask the tough questions. And one of those is, who is funding these startups? The reality on the ground here is the fact that a lot of investors in African startups are actually not Africans, they are foreign investors. They're people from the Western world. About 80% of foreign investors actually invest in African startups. And one thing about human beings is that they trust people who are familiar to them. This is actually something that is psychological, that is in all human beings. Most of the times you gravitate towards something that feels familiar. And because we have a lot of foreign investors, a lot of the times they'll feel comfortable to give money to an African startup when they see a familiar face in that startup. And this is why most times they desire to have a white founder, because that makes them trust that the money that they are investing is going into good hands. That is normal human behavior. And that's why you always see it's very easy to divide human beings using divide and conquer, because this idea of us versus them, it's something that is deeply ingrained in a lot of people. So it's really not shocking that a foreign investor would want to have someone that looks like them in a company that they want to put their money into. On top of this, we are not going to pretend that when you look at the perception of Africa, especially in the Western world, it's not one that is filled with integrity and honesty. For a very long time, Africa has been painted as this helpless continent that is also full of corruption and people just waiting for handouts. And a lot of these foreign investors are coming in with that mentality. And so when an African founder goes to them and is asking for money, for them in their heads, they're thinking, this person, can I trust them? They've had years and years of being told through the media that you cannot trust African people. So why would they trust you? Why would they? And we can talk about how, the media, the Western media has always misrepresented us. But even when you look at the leaders that we have in a lot of African countries, corruption is their bread and butter. They don't have integrity. They do not want to be held accountable. And actually, a lot of the times, people from other places will always look at the state of your leaders and assume that that is how all of you in the country are. I mean, after all, you can't keep on saying that the leaders are the problem, and yet each election cycle people still put in these leaders who apparently are bad leaders. What does that say about the people? And that's why for a lot of them, the only way they can really entrust their money into an African startup is if they have that familiar face, someone that looks like them, a white person, because that is going to give them the confidence to invest in that company. But of course, it doesn't mean that just because someone is a white founder, they're not corrupt or they absolutely know what they're doing. I mean, we've seen over and over startups with white founders not being able to penetrate the Kenyan market. We had Mobius, which was making cars, made in Kenya, made in Africa cars. There was one, was it called Kuza? It was actually called Kune Foods, that was trying to create affordable food for the Kenyan market. In fact, a lot of these startups end up just failing. Yes, they get a lot of investment, they raise a lot of money, but most times they just end up failing because the problems they're trying to solve are problems that are sort of non-existent in the African context. You see, one thing when it comes to this foreign investment is that a lot of the times investors come with their own prescriptions and they're really not interested in solving the problems that we have in Africa. They're interested in solving problems that they think are in Africa because they're thinking with this Western mind. A good example is that in a lot of Western countries, a lot of people are really talking about sustainability, gender equality, and a lot of foreign investors, when they come to African startups, they're expecting African startups that will also talk about sustainability and gender equality. But if you're being honest, in a lot of African countries right now, a lot of people are not even talking about that. Are these problems that we have? Yes, but are these the priority? No. If we take the good example of Kenya, we have a poverty rate of about 39%. A lot of people are still trying to fight for basic needs. You're telling me that you're going to come to someone and tell them to care about the environment, about sustainability, when they're actually fighting to find money to buy food for today. If we go back to the example of Mobius, they wanted to make cars that are made in Africa. But when you really look at the fabric of especially Kenyan people, a lot of them are not buying cars because they want a made in Kenya car. A lot of people are buying cars, yes, because it's functional, but more so because the kind of car you have signifies the kind of respect that should be given to you. This is why a lot of Kenyans, most especially, are obsessed with buying even second-hand vehicles as long as they are German machines, made in Japan, those kinds of things, not like made in Kenya. And so what? Made in Kenya, but no one knows about the brand. No one cares. A lot of people want people to say, oh, this person, anaendesha gari ya nguvu, they are driving an important car. People want to be respected based on the car they are driving. And this is something that a lot of these white founders do not understand because they haven't lived in Kenya. They haven't lived in Africa. When you're bringing all these cultural aspects, it's not just about an exchange. You know, a lot of people think business is just about an exchange. No, it's also about the needs and desires of people. There's so many things that people buy for functional use, but we are at a point right now where we have so much choice that at the end of the day, you need to be solving an emotional problem for you to be able to get through to the market. That's why right now, as a business, your differentiation cannot be, I have a quality product. There's a lot of that. What else are you bringing to the table? And as much as, yes, we want to talk about how it's unfair, how those foreign investors always prefer an African startup that has a white founder, we also need to ask ourselves why we as Africans are not investing in our own startups. It is true that in a lot of African societies, a lot of people do not really care about investing in business. In fact, right now, if you went to people and told them that you need money to start a business, they will tell you they don't have money. But if you died, suddenly the same people have thousands to give to your funeral. You cannot be a beggar but also want to dictate how people give you money. And in this instance, a lot of African startups are borrowing money, begging for money from foreign investors, but you also want to dictate how foreign investors are going to give you that money. It doesn't work like that. This is business. I've always found it incredibly fascinating that when it comes to this idea of building Africa, a lot of the conversations are always being directed and managed by foreign people. And of course, there's so many other Africans also talking about how we can make Africa better. But what I've always found to be the problem here is that a lot of Africans just go to conferences talking about how we can raise money, how we can raise investment, but the action isn't there. We need to stop talking about how we can make Africa better and actually start doing that. And the action is actually the hard part because it means putting money in ideas, in problem solving that is not going to give you immediate profit. When you look at some of the biggest companies in the world, like Facebook, like Amazon, they didn't make a profit for quite some time. I always find with a lot of African people, most especially when it comes to business, a lot of people are just thinking about profit. We need to get rid of that mindset and start thinking about how we can create solutions to the problems that we have in a long-term manner. Foundation should be on ensuring we have sustainable communities instead of just making money. The African business environment is a different context from the Western one. And as African people, as African business people, we should be thinking of the context we are in instead of trying to emulate the West. And this is why it's even better to not take that foreign investment just to get funding for your startup if you know you're going to be forced to solve problems that don't exist in Africa, because it means you're going to fail. So this is a larger conversation that we need to have. It's really easy to start blaming the foreign investors for discrimination, for wanting white founders, but we also need to ask ourselves, why are we not funding our own startups? And why are we expecting foreign investors to give money with no strings attached? This is business. So as much as the Silicon Savannah is giving Silicon Valley a run for its money, we also need to ask ourselves, are we the ones that are in charge? Are we really winning when we are still depending on somebody else's shoes to take us through the finish line?